Thank you, Andy, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I guess you can all see my screen and hear me now.
Yep.
Great, so I'll begin. So my talk today is on the acquisition of color categories through learning, and I'll be telling you about some differences we've discovered in two experiments between categories that differ in hue or in lightness. So, as we know, the perceptual representation of color is multidimensional, and this is reflected in the majority of color sorting systems or perceptual color spaces. So, for example, the CIE lab space has dimensions of hue, chroma, and lightness. There's also a secondary dimension of saturation, which incorporates both colorfulness and lightness. But we also have color categories. And obviously, those color categories can differ. Some of them differ in hue, and some of them differ in lightness, where the distinctions, where the boundaries of these categories fall. Here, I'm just showing the World Color Survey Mansell chips in that setup in which they are often used, and I labeled them. And if I now add boundaries for example, red and brown, you can see that red and brown have hue boundary, but they also have, in one instance, you could say that they actually have their own lightness boundary. Well, some colors differ mainly just in lightness, and other colors really just have a very big hue boundary, such as green and blue. So the question one could raise is, are there any differences between hue and lightness-based color categories? So differences in the firmness of the categories, the sort of firmness of its boundary, or the relativity. And we examined this on the example of Goluboy and Sini in a recent study with Galina Paramei and Joe McInnes. So we had participants categorizing a set of 15 colors that all differed in the same steps in CIE LAB space, ranging from what is here sample 1 or 15. And in one instance, we just create a set of equal steps that goes towards what should be a firmly perceived 100% as a green color. And here we go from a light blue towards, in those steps, towards something that should be classified as a dark blue. And to create a sort of a frequency bias, so a bias based on how many times you've seen a sample, we either show the bottom part of these 15 samples, so the first 7 samples, twice as frequently as the lighter samples, or we do vice versa. And we do that both for the blue range or for the blue-green range. And we actually found that the frequency biases affected the Sini-Goluboy, so the lightness boundary, much more, revealing a relative instability of this boundary. We did not find this for Goluboy green. This is actually consistent with some observations of Davies and colleagues that in acquisition of these Russian color categories, they definitely are basic color words, but there are still some mistakes made with these words relative to other words by 5- or 6-year-olds. So based on this, we concluded that although lightness-based Sini and Goluboy are basic color categories, they are not as categorically distinct or well demarcated. So then the next question that arises is, are hue and lightness-based categories acquired in the same or a similar way? So the study by Davies I just cited might suggest that the lightness color acquisition may be a little bit harder. But there has been an experimental work by Ozgen and Davies in 2002, which looked at modeling by using perceptual learning, by modeling color acquisition in a green area of space. And they concluded, based on their experiments, that this acquisition operates similarly for lightness and hue-based categories. And in fact, they report one asymmetry. While hue-learners manifest categorical perception effects at both the hue boundary, which they learned, and also the lightness boundary, which they hadn't been trained on, so they somehow acquired incidentally. the lightness learners only manifest categorical perception effects at the learned lightness boundary. So one might say that these categorical perception effects are somewhat inconsistent with our previous work and the previous paper on learning, because one should think that if lightness-based categories are less firmly demarcated, they should be learned less efficiently than hue-based categories, rather than somehow being learned so efficiently. So we asked the question, how does the learning process depend on the perceptual dimension that is being acquired? So this is a very similar question to the one asked by Ozgen and Davies, just slightly rephrased, and we used very similar methods. We had two primary aims. So Ozgen and Davies report a wealth of discrimination data. So after the learning is conducted, they report how their participants perform distinctions, discriminations of colors along learned or unlearned dimensions. We actually wanted to collect learning data. So we didn't just want to report the discrimination, but we actually wanted to see where are the errors. Do they congregate symmetrically around the learned boundary, or are they asymmetrical, indicating some sort of asymmetry in that area of color space, so something that means that you are both having to respond to hue and lightness, so not all the lightness level hues would be equal. And as we started conducting our study, a secondary aim emerged as we discovered in our first experiment that we changed a few things, small things, and realized our results were somewhat different. And then we actually conducted the second experiment in which we just shifted the stimulus space slightly, and we wanted to see how the effects would generalize across relatively small shifts of the position of the boundary within the range of hues given to participants. So first I'll tell you about the methods of Ozgen and Davies, as our methods are, as I said, very, very similar. They use 16 colors that they pick from the Mansell space, and you can see they go from green towards a hint of the blue-green part of the spectrum. And they have also 4 steps of lightness. And there you can see that you could split these either as with the hue boundary down the middle, so vertically, or with lightness boundary. And we had control participants which would just see the 16 colors in a grid like this, and then would proceed to do the discrimination task. But you also had hue and lightness learners. And the way that they learned was in 2 stages. The first one would be context learning. So here, a color comes in the middle. The colors were randomly pulled. So if this was, for example, a lightness learning here, actually, I think it's not, I think this is a hue learning here. So you can see here participants are learning the hue boundary. Every color would be drawn randomly. Obviously, you create some space around the boundary, and then you randomly draw samples from this region or from this region, 16 positions here, and the participant has to place the color on the correct side. So once they place the first color, then they place it either with that color or on the opposite side. They get auditory feedback, so they're nowhere explicitly told what's the distinction. They have to learn it themselves. There are stopping criteria. They have to do it for a certain period of time and get as many of them correct in a row. Then once they've graduated from this learning, they get a more abstract singleton learning, which operates in exactly the same way. Here, the participant just has to send the color left or right, and again, they'll get feedback and have to do it correctly for a certain amount of time. But now they don't get to see the context while they're studying. So this is a more abstract stage of learning. And this, there is a learning session on one day, and then on the second day, the participants who trained, they come back, they do a bit of top-up learning, and then they do a same different delay discrimination. They'll see a color sample, there's a 5-second delay, and then they see another sample, which they look at until response. And this other sample, there's 2 blocks. One is a hue block. So for example, differences are always in 1 step. So it could be, for example, this sample compared to this sample, that would be a different pair. within the same category, if it was a hue block, or it could be these two samples, they cross the boundary, or it can be the same sample. So you saw a sample and then later you see it again, and you have to say same or different. And then you also get lightness blocks. So you can see how you can measure discrimination, but we also wanted to see how many errors were made, especially during the context learning stage. But we also have to do certain changes in the methods. The first change that I made was that in the first experiment, I changed to CIE-LAB space from the Mansell space. And the reason why I did that is because saturation is better controlled based on the work of Schiller and colleagues from Gegenfertner's group in Gießen that we heard about it from Matteo Toscani's talk. So in that paper, it shows that CIE-LAB is a good space to control for saturation. So I took the same delta E of 6 and made just the hue difference. So here you can see where the boundary would be. And I took relatively the same lightnesses. Then my participants performed much better at discriminating hue. Somehow this magnified hue difference, of course, was created some incidental findings. So in the second experiment, we actually went with a very, very close replication in terms of the stimuli. These are pretty much the same hue angles as in their study, and the lightnesses are only slightly lower because I had a problem reproducing some of the colors on my screen. So I reduced every color by 1.3 candelas. We had 15 participants per group just to have a bit more power. And because I want to study error for every single chip, I changed the training. Rather than drawing random colors from these areas, which here actually, you could see this from this area to this area here, if you eliminate an area on the boundary, it would be a delta E of 6. So only really TJ and this. I actually showed stimulus colors. So my participants would see the 16 samples, and if they got it wrong, they would see them again. Because I wanted to analyze errors made on each color. But of course, as a consequence of that, as participants can learn more relationally because the samples are always evenly distributed across the space, my learning was much more efficient. I also changed another thing, and that's the number of discrimination pairs. Ozgen and Davies had in each block 48 different pairs, so that would be either within or across the boundary. And 32 same pairs, so repetitions, each color basically repeated, each of the 16 colors repeated twice. And I just made the 48 for both. The reason was to avoid response bias. And finally, I also debriefed participants on labeling strategies because I thought that that's actually quite important. When, for example, children acquire categories, they use the labels that they've partially acquired. So I wanted to know what the participants were thinking as they were doing the task. And I'll show you the labeling first because it's interesting. And it's interesting to see the results of everything else in that context. So the hue-learners use the labels green and blue. The lightness-learners actually used quite a more varied range of labels. Some used no labels, and in fact, one explicitly told us that they judged the contrast, the luminance contrast of the patches against the background rather than actually discriminate lightness. One participant told us that they labeled each sample after some paint associations. And then we actually had the range of participants who actually reported using hue categories, even though that's not what they learned. And then the most participants reported using light-dark or some combination of light-dark and hue categories. And now I'll show you the results of the context learning. So this is from my experiment in which I spaced out the hues more in CIE-LAB space. The results are shown out of a total of 1. So these are the proportions of errors. I think we can focus on the middle 2 rows, the middle 2 hues. These are from the hue-learners. And you can actually see that they make more errors asymmetrically for the lightest color on what they would call a green. and for the darkest color on what they would call a blue. And this is quite in line with some sort of Bezold-Brücke effect, where the blueness is magnified if for lighter things. So this chip kind of wants to go with these guys, and the opposite is manifest for this. And lightness learners had errors mainly for hue, row 1 of hue, and for the lighter colors, so not symmetrical distribution. In the second experiment, so same representation, we get slightly different results. So here you can see that this row here, in the previous experiment, that row was on the other side of the boundary. So this is all like shifted sort of by 1. And you can see again, there is some asymmetries. This color in particular, once you do all the corrected tests, it turned out that this one was the driver of interaction. And we find for the lightness, it's not exactly the same, but kind of similar to what was the case before. Now I'll show you the discrimination results. And first I'll show you the results from Ozgen and Davies. This is from the task where you do the same different delay discrimination. On the left-hand side, depicted with black squares, are the hue categorizers compared to the empty circles, which are controls. They also show a between subject confidence interval, and they actually plot the same CI for the groups on each graph. And you can see that the hue categorizers, so comparison is within the category or across the category. They calculated an A prime. So this is like a non-parametric D prime. They use the same responses to calculate an A prime for within and across. And you can see hue categorizers have learned something both about hue and to a much, much lesser extent about lightness. Now let's look at the triangles. They are the lightness categorizers here. And the lightness categorizers do not differ from controls in terms of hue judgments, but for lightness judgments, they show some small improvement for across relative within. And also if you look compared to the control group. Now I'm going to show you my results from my 2 experiments. I'm going to plot them in relation to Ozgen and Davies on this plot here. Well, I plotted the line at 0.5, which would be a kind of A prime at chance performance. First, let's look at hue discrimination. So we're discriminating against the dimension of hue. I'm just adding the Ozgen and Davies data, which I read off using a plot capture. So you can see hue-learners have learned something about hue, and lightness-learners haven't learned anything about hue. So my second experiment I will show you first because it is more similar to the Ozgen and Davies. And you can see my controls are similar to their controls. My hue-learners show an effect, so I replicate the across-within difference here. My lightness learners do not. So my experiment 2, which is the one that's very similar, completely replicates everything they found for hue discriminations. In my experiment, where I made the delta E, not because in Mansell space there are also some small saturation differences. When I controlled my colors in CIE LAB space, and you can see actually my controls are already performing better. So somehow the hue is becoming more salient, this distinction, it all makes sense. And I find the effect obviously here in hue, but I actually find the same effect in lightness-learners. So something here about this distinction is more obvious, more salient once I space them out. Now for the lightness dimension, I'm again just showing the data from Ozgen and Davies replotted. And now I am adding data from my second experiment. My controls are similar, except for across, my controls were slightly better than their controls. For hue learners, my hue learners didn't learn anything about lightness. Their data is not, their data belongs to the same distribution. I tested that as in their study. And my lightness learners, they goes in the right direction, but it's just not sufficiently statistically significant. I think it's the study may have overestimated the effect size of this effect. For my other experiment, you can see that they are performing more, again, they're performing similar the controls to how it was. Well, does that make sense? Because it's the same overall differences. No lightness learning for hue-learners, so no lightness learning for lightness-learners. I also did a generalized linear mixed effect model analysis where I, rather than computing A prime, I just put same discriminations within and across. And then I also added experiment as a between subject model to have more power, because then you combine the samples. But even this way, I failed to capture any robust effect learning for my lightness learners on lightness. So as a conclusion, we replicate the hue cross-category advantage from Ozgen and Davies, but we failed to obtain an advantage for lightness discriminations. This is in line with these categories being less firm and thus harder to acquire, and may explain why in the Davies et al. 1998 paper, Russian children, even at age 5-6, still sometimes struggled with the lightness-based Sini Goluboy. What is interesting here in my learning data? The learning errors are not uniform across the boundary. They congregate along certain, let's call them difficult regions. And even when we debriefed the participants, they would report that certain colors were very difficult to learn, or you could actually see them squirm when making errors on these colors, as I was in the room when I tested them. It seemed from some of the error patterns that the underlying perceptual representations that they had to extract their categories from interacted with the existing verbal labels, such as green and blue. And the potential mechanism for that, as I also do attentional selection of color, it dawned on me quickly, could be some sort of a relational attentional selection mechanism, like the mechanism discussed in Stephanie Becker's theory, where when we have targets and distractors, we actually select our targets based on relations with the distractors. It's much simpler to do that than to tune to absolute values. And this is consistent with both the label feedback hypothesis, in the sense that the labels do have an effect, but even more consistent with Witzel's categorical facilitation, because Witzel is the one who proposes that the attention is the key mechanism here. So rather than some language warping the perceptual space, it is simply a phenomenon of attention being directed across the boundary. For future directions, I would say a possible explanation which has been put forward for universals in color naming, and I'm showing you here a quote, is that the irregular space, the irregular shape of the color space leads to interactions of hue and saturation and lightness, and makes several large bumps. And these bumps basically is what drives the universals. And since then, you have this discussion of how much it's the perceptual dimension or this bumpiness of the color space, and how much it's the labels that connect and shape the space. I would like to propose that actually the key outstanding question may be the mechanism that mediates the link between these two types of representation, rather than trying to look which one is more important. And I would like to embark on a research program looking for targeting specifically experimentally these attentional mechanisms, and so to be able to conclude that here I am just speculating, but further experiments will hopefully help to make firmer conclusions. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would especially like to thank Galina Paramei, who I got the pleasure to work with and became interested in this topic through collaborating with her and getting always great advice from. Thank you very much.